I think as a starting point, I want to harken back to the end of the presentation that you just heard, which really focused on this challenge of how do we ferret out the news and information that's out there. There are a lot of things that I think are better in the news ecosystem of today from the world of 10 or 20 years ago. And one of them is that there are many more choices, many more voices potentially heard on this open platform, but it is much harder to feel like you're staying in touch with what's going on if there's 1,000 or 300 or 500, whatever number of sites it is, sliced in how many different categories and neighborhoods and towns. And so this research that we're going to talk to you about today is in part a second effort to look at the news ecosystem of Chicago as a network. And I think we sometimes need to be reminded that the unique thing about the web is the ability to link to another piece of information and have people follow that. The fact that that exists, the web exists, has spawned an enormous amount of research in understanding how networks are structured, and not just networks of web pages and sites. This project is, as with the project you've just seen, it is an update in part. In 2010, we did the first network analysis of the Chicago news ecosystem. And part of our goal this time was to come back 2 years later, this time end of March, beginning of April of this year, and look at the ecosystem of sites and how they're connected by links. And you'll be hearing a lot from Zach and me about what we found in that study and what's the same and different from 2 years ago. We also wanted to add a new dimension to this, which was, look, we know that it's easy to link, right? I mean, any site can link to any other site. The question at the end of the day, in terms of measuring whether a link has any impact, is do people click on it and do they go to the other site? And that's a harder question to answer. Any individual site actually has a fair amount of information on that, although they may or may not look at it in their web analytics. What's very hard to do is to look at the ecosystem as a whole. We wanted to look at whether links do in fact drive traffic. And by aggregating information from a bunch of sites, see if we can learn some things about the overall patterns of usage. So, this will break into two sections. We'll talk first about the links research and then about the web analytics research. And for the links research, I'm going to give the mic to Zach to kind of walk you in.
Hi. So the first thing you'd probably want to know if we're going to analyze the link network is how do we collect data on who links to who? And the way that we do it is we use a tool called the web crawler. And the reason why it's called the web crawler, it's rather aptly named, is because there's a little tool, it's like a spider bot, that we give it a list of seed sites. So in this case, we gave it 380 regularly updated Chicago news sites. And it travels to each of those sites. And not only does it go from which of those sites link to the others and collect the link information, but it also dives 3 levels deep into each of the sites that we provided it. So it'll go to the home page, it'll go and follow the links to the one page beyond, another page beyond that, and follow out where each of those sites connects to the other sites that it links to. And what this does is we have it iterate a couple of times, and it basically combs through and gathers a group that becomes our final network of sites that we looked at for this analysis. And in this particular case, we were very careful to remove isolated sites from the end, because whenever you run a web crawl, you'll wind up with some maybe 15% of sites that are left that have no connections, but they were just picked up early on in the crawl.
Okay. To simplify our analysis, we categorized the sites. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. It is enumerated in the report, but to give you a sense of what we looked at, we looked first at legacy sites, which are traditional media, branded as traditional media. We had a group of sites we call legacy affiliated, which are owned by legacy media but not branded as legacy media. Micro publishers are the hyperlocal and niche sites that cover particular topics or audiences. And unlike the previous study, we do, in this research, look just as closely at the organizations, institutions, nonprofit, government agencies, because in fact, in today's world, they are information providers, and they are linked to, actually, some of them quite heavily. Finally, we have a category we call national brand sites, which are the Everyblocks and the Patches and the Huffington Post, which are kind of a national site, but to some degree segment geographically. And one of I think the key findings of this study is that those sites are ever more important in the ecosystem. And as Tom alluded, it's not a black or white situation. They bring in a lot of traffic and they refer a lot of traffic. And so they're important in the ecosystem and they are not necessarily displacing. They are in fact, in our world of the network, actually perhaps helping get people to relevant content. We also categorized our sites a little further when we looked in separate categories to sort of, when we were looking at niches, are they geographic niches, are they topical or audience niches, or are they websites that are part of a mass media brand? This is kind of the outline of how they organized 301 sites ultimately in our network, grouped in a variety in each category. Again, the details in the report. Zach?
So when Rich describes the sites as creating a network, this is a great way to visualize and understand how that works, right? Because when you talk about it, it's kind of conceptual, but you can actually diagram this out. So in this diagram, it shows the new news ecosystem, but you have the circles as sites, and the lines that connect them, those are the presence or absence of a link. And in this particular diagram, it shows all the sites that we found to be in our ecosystem, and they are colored by category, so the categories that Rich just described. So you can see, for instance, the light blues are national brand, the purple are micro publisher, grays are organization institution, salmon's legacy, and the fuchsia is legacy affiliated. And what you can see is some of those groups tend to cluster together more than others. One particularly interesting finding, though, that we had was when we did this study back in 2010, we found that the network had a density of 1.6%. And what density is looking at is, of all the possible ties that could exist between a group of sites, how many actually exist? So in the first network we looked at 2 years ago, 1.61% of possible ties existed in the network. That's pretty normal when you're looking at a social network, whether it's people or websites or what have you. What was really interesting for us was in 2012, the density pretty much doubled. You have 2.95% density, despite the fact that there's almost 100 more sites in the network, which if you think about it, if you add sites to the network, the number of possible ties shoots up exponentially. So the fact that the density still doubled with even more sites was particularly interesting to us. And the next thing I'd say is, and you'll see this through the dashboard that we'll talk about in just a second in the report, it's possible to look at the influence of different sites based upon its structural position within the network. And what I mean by that is, depending upon how many links your site has, and also who are the folks who link to you and the people that you link to, it says different things about your site's ability to share information or receive information. So in the final report, we look at 5 types of influence, but for the sake of brevity, we show two here. The first we look at are authorities. And the way that someone is described as an authority is they have a really high in-degree centrality. In-degree centrality is pretty simple. It's the number of sites that link to you. It's kind of like your followers on Twitter. And you can see the larger nodes here. Those are the sites that have the highest in-degree centrality and the highest authority scores.
We're also showing on this and several of the other slides the top 10 in the category of authorities. What you'll see there is the Chicago Tribune is the most heavily linked to site. You also see kind of the diversity of sites that are linked to a lot. And it includes the city government site, includes other news sites, and includes Chicago Now, which is the Tribune's blog site. It includes the website for the CTA. It includes the New York Times. So a lot of local sites, in fact, link to the New York Times as an authority, which makes sense. You would expect that.
So as promised, here's our second type of influence. You have some sites that are hubs. It's kind of like the opposite of an authority. Hubs link out to lots of other sites. And as you can see here, just like the previous diagram, the larger circle here has a higher out-degree centrality, so they have many more links to other sites in the network than their peers.
Right. And on this one, you can see, again, they're sized by their out-degree centrality or hub score. You can see in the center of the graphic the 2 big light blue ones. That is Huffington Post and Every Block. They do link out quite a lot. A little bit to the east of them is the largest purple circle, which is our friends at Gapers Block, which is, and we're going to talk about Gapers Block several points during this presentation because they are a noteworthy site in terms of their not only how much they link, but how they do, in fact, drive traffic to other sites. You'll see a wide range of other things on this site, from traditional media to neighborhood blogs to Windy Citizen, a site that is also showed up important in both studies and is actually now no longer with us, and we'll come back to that point later in the presentation as well. So the next set of graphics, we're just going to kind of use the same basic map and talk about a few other things. The first is that if you can actually look at some of these sites by ownership groups. So on this graphic, what you will see, the big cluster of blue sites over here on your left is the patch sites, all of which at the moment are in the suburbs. I actually learned today they're moving into Chicago, so word coming down the pike. The purple sites are Sun-Times and Sun-Times related sites. The fuchsia sites are the Tribune Company sites, and the red sites off on the far right are the New City sites. And you can see that, in fact, the thickness of the line separating these sites is reflective of the number of links between them. We can also represent this graphically or numerically, and what you'll see is that all of these sites, Tribune, Sun-Times, Patch, New City, link heavily, fairly incestuously, to other sites in the family. But it's also worth pointing out that Patch, which actually among those four has the highest percentage of sites that only link to other Patch sites, because they really have embraced linking in a way that traditional media have been slow to do. While 92% of their links are to other sites, they still have an enormous number, 237 links, out to other sites that are not Patch sites, which far exceeds the number for Sun-Times, Tribune, New City, for instance. We also took a look at sort of the sites that have the most links to other sites, just raw numbers of links, both in terms of raw numbers and then how many different sites they link to. Here, what you can see is that actually the site that actually linked during our crawl period that linked to had the most other links was actually the Morton Grove Patch site. And I think you'll find many of those are links to neighboring communities like Skokie and Evanston Patch. But you can also see that there are very different patterns here. Chicago Breaking News, which is the Tribune Company's breaking news sites, has a very large number of links, but they link only to 3 sites, I believe 2 of which are other Tribune sites. Whereas a site like Gapers Block and Huffington Post and Every Block, they have large numbers of links and are very promiscuous in their linking. And so Gapers Block linked to 72 of our 301 sites during this period, as did Huffington Post. Every Block linked to 64 of our 301 sites.
So one thing that I'm particularly excited to announce was back when we did this in 2010, we got tons of questions and feedback on how can we explore the results ourselves. Because as you can see, there's information on 300 sites in there, and we've got all sorts of cool data on each and every site. So instead of giving you a giant Excel document to go through, because I still struggle with Excel, we actually made an online accessible dashboard that Rich is going to go to right now.
Yep, which unfortunately we lost the preloading on, so hang on.
That's all right. Here's the top one right there. And the idea behind the dashboard is it lets you telescope through and explore the different sites in the network. So you'll see this at the homepage. There's a slideshow that you can walk through here. It has a couple of the slides we had in the presentation, but also some more since we didn't have time to show all the types of influence. But where things get really fun is if you click through on any of the diagrams, they're all SVGs. So you can actually go through, see the labels for each site, zoom in, control plus, and anything you want there. What's even more cool, though, and a lot more fun, is there's 2 other sections on the site. One of which I'll skip over real quick. It shows group-to-group connectivity. You can see the extent to which different groups connect to one another. But the coolest piece is you can actually go through and there's a rank list for all the sites in the network. And it's by each different type of influence and also by its category or scope. So for instance, if you want to have all the sites arranged in order of hub, you can just click on the hub button there, and it will show you which sites have the highest hub score, and you can click through. You can also filter by any of the categories, scopes, what have you. And if you double-click on a site, it'll give you its profile on the right-hand side. All the scores are percentile-based, so you'll see if it has 5 stars, it means it's really highly ranked. If it has only 1, it's in the bottom 20th percentile. But what it tells you is it gives you an idea of roughly how does your site or whichever site you're looking at compare to the whole, and it gives you an idea to see what sort of things might this site be particularly well positioned to do based on its position in the social network. And you can go to the link actually, so it's I think we had it.
Yeah. Well, hang on. We'll go back to the PowerPoint. Give me a minute. This mouse is very balky. So give me a minute. There we go. And now I'll just need to get over to the... Okay, here we go. Okay, so that's the link. public.syndiosocial.com/chilinks. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the research, which is actually, I think, unique. I don't think anybody's ever tried to do this before. Oh, sorry, one final conclusion on this. Since we've done this research now twice, we are able to, and the methodology was a little bit different. We had a different way of identifying the seed sites, and we had a different web crawler that we used. So we have to be a little cautious in drawing conclusions, and comparing the results of the two. That said, it's interesting that there were 13 sites that show up, despite the different methodology, 2 years apart, as highly ranked sites on one or more of our network centrality measures. We're calling those sort of our enduring leaders. They are a very diverse group. They are everything from ChicagoArtistResource.com, which was a site that I think the city actually funded to help people find information about art in Chicago, to the national aggregator-based sites like Chicagoist, to local sites like the Reader and the Tribune, municipal sites like the City of Chicago, Gapers Block, the CTA site, and New York Times. So, I think if you do this multiple times, you start to see the same patterns. You say, well, these sites really are more important in the ecosystem, and they've been around a while, and they have some staying power. So, as I said, the links research, to the best of my knowledge, has not been tried anywhere before, and we weren't entirely sure that it was going to be possible to do what we sought to do. We knew we had 301 sites. We knew that we had crawled the network in late March and early April, and we basically said, we believe we can ask the local publishers to give us their web analytics referrer data. And we did. I don't remember how many we asked for. We did, in order to get it, we were very careful to say, if we mention anything from links research about your analytics data, we're not going to do it without talking to you first. So our goal here was to get it and understand it, as opposed to reveal shocking truths about the patterns of traffic. And with that caveat, we were able to get the data from publishers representing 98 of our 301 sites during the same period when we're doing the crawl. What we asked for was referring domains for these sites. This means we exclude traffic that's driven by search, and we are excluding traffic that is what we call direct traffic, which is people who type in the site or name or use a bookmark or favorite list. And then we kind of group the sites into 3 size categories. So we have everything in this data set, from the Chicago Tribune, the Sun-Times, and the Daily Herald, which are our 3 large sites, down to the neighborhood and niche sites, 80 of those in the small category. And we stratified this by the number of referring visits during the 2 weeks that we were looking. The medium category is mostly traditional media-related sites. It is, for instance, all of the Sun-Times Media suburban paper sites, the Naperville Sun, Pioneer Local, and they're kind of in the middle range. So really, most of the independent, small niche sites almost all fall in the small sites category. So here are some conclusions that we were able to draw, keeping in mind, I would emphasize this up front. There were a lot of incongruities in the data we got that we had to clean up or make some assumptions about to get the apples to apples comparisons we wanted to make. And as you will see when I get there, I would really actually love to go back and refine this and perhaps work with some other researchers to build out this data set, because I think there's a potential to do something that's really useful in understanding the nature of how traffic moves around the ecosystem in a place like Chicago. But we were able to draw some at least tentative and interesting conclusions. The first is, basically, if you're a small site, you rely, and again, this isn't surprising, but it's good to see it documented. If you're a small site, you rely much more heavily on the rest of the ecosystem than if you're a large site. So among the sites, for the sites that we identified in the crawl, among the large sites, only 2.2% of the visits came from those crawl 301 sites, whereas among the medium and small size sites, 25% of the visits came from those sites. We also were able to document, again, not necessarily surprisingly, but helpful in understanding the way the ecosystem works, that in fact, a site that links more to other sites drives more traffic to other sites. That's especially true, or at least especially evident, when we look at the smaller sites. So we did a correlation coefficient for links and traffic among our small categorization sites, and the correlation coefficient, putting my statistics hat on, was 0.492, which essentially means the number of links explains 49% of the variance in traffic among the small sites. Now, both of these figures probably understate the true amount of traffic within the ecosystem, because we have thousands of sites in our data set, actually, a lot more than the 300, and there's some of those that we never found in the crawl that we didn't attempt to categorize at this stage. The second set of things that we looked at, and Tom did steal a little bit of the thunder here earlier, Social media is enormous, and it is especially enormous among small sites. So among the large category sites, 18–19% of the traffic comes from Facebook and Twitter together. Among the medium sites, it's 31%, and among the small sites, it's over half. So literally, it's true, I think, that if you want traffic, you want an audience online, at this point, for a smaller site, having a regularly updated, good, engaging Facebook page is probably as important as having a regularly updated, good homepage. And I don't know that, I mean, if you're thinking about how are your resources allocated, if you're a publisher in a small site category, think heavily about whether you're putting enough resources into your Facebook page at this point. Third, trying to get at this relationship between traffic and links. We wanted, one of our goals was, can we understand what practices by sites that link cause more traffic to move around the ecosystem? So we really drilled down here. We looked at the small category of sites where we had documented a relationship between links and traffic that was strong. We figured out, basically, we calculated a visit per link ratio. Well, keeping in mind, we actually don't know whether the specific link that we captured in the crawl is the one that drove the traffic. We're just counting links, counting visits, doing the calculation. And then we were able to say, okay, well, among the small sites that link traffic out, what's the average number of visits per link? And which sites seem to dramatically exceed that? And out of that, we identified 3 sites in our small site category that drive more than the average number of visits per link. They are Gapers Block, Center Square Journal, which is a hyper-local site serving Lincoln Square, and Catalyst Chicago, our education reform site. Linda Lenz, the publisher, is sitting here in the front row. Just taking a look at the numbers for a minute, at Gapers Block, you can see, we've already talked about how frequently they link. They had 106 links in our database to other sites in our data set, and drive an average of 40 visits per link. Center Square Journal and Catalyst have fewer than 106, but they do link more than the average number of sites. What really defines them in terms of maybe why do they send so much traffic, it looks very clear when you evaluate the sites. All 3 of them, first off, they link frequently. They see it as a key part of their mission to link to other sites. It's not just about getting them to come to the site themselves. Secondly, they link from prominent locations. So the home page, in the case of Gapers Block and Center Square Journal, Catalyst, the homepage, and their regularly updated blog page, their notebook page. On the right, what you'll see is a representation of the merge section of Gapers Block, which is a regular standing area of the homepage, the upper left, that exists exactly to drive people to other sites. It is a constantly updated link blog of information to elsewhere on the web that they assume their readers are going to be interested in. It is a level of prominence that very few sites give. And you can see that this does really drive real traffic. And I think it has made the Gapers Block audience more likely to follow links than other sites because they come to this site to get those links and to follow them. Now, I think this raises a number of really interesting questions that, if we're worried and concerned about what does the new ecosystem translate into in terms of people being informed, which is kind of where I think we start here in this project. In traditional media, the traditional newspaper, Phil Meyer, a great scholar and researcher, several years ago coined the idea of the influence model. And the influence model basically says, if your site is respected, read, viewed, especially by influential people, you get a better business out of it because the advertisers want to ride along with that influence. So social influence translates into business influence in the traditional media. And local newspapers historically in the local markets, at least one in every market, really tended to have that. They had that social influence because of the size, the quality of their audience, and that meant you had a successful business model. Well, the web is different. So we have here a screenshot of Windy Citizen, which you've alluded to a couple times. It showed up very high in our influence ratings, if you will, on the web in 2 straight studies. And it's no longer with us. Brad Flora shut it down a few months ago, basically saying, you know what, I haven't been able to make this into a business, and the other ventures I'm doing right now are a better business than Windy Citizen is. And here, to me, encapsulates the challenge. On the web, getting more inbound traffic could translate into some more money because if you sell advertising based on CPMs, more traffic does equate to more revenue. But influence driving traffic is both hard to measure and very hard to monetize. I don't doubt that Gaber's blog gets more traffic than it would otherwise, at least one click to the homepage, because people know that it will guide them to other information elsewhere on the web. On the other hand, that might be a one-click visit. And Andrew could tell you, I think he'd tell you he gets quite a few one-click visits, which in the parlance of web analytics is a really bad thing. It's called a bounce. And a bounce means I come for one page and go off. Well, in fact, I think probably the bounce value of Gaber's blog is one of the best things about it, is I come there, I get information, it sends me someplace else, but it's hard to monetize that directly. And I think that is a challenge for all of us to think about. And that's why we among the reasons why we end our report with some thoughts about, okay, what does this mean and what are some next steps that we might think about? So first, I think if you are a publisher in a local market, the evidence here suggests, first off, your goal is to inform your readers. You should be linking. There's plenty of great content out there. It is diverse, and literally the decision that you will take advantage of this inherent strength of the web to link is a good one, keeping in mind what I just said, which is it's not necessarily clear how exactly you monetize that. Clearly, social media, the data here supports what I think we know intuitively, but now you have some numbers to throw at it. If half of all traffic among small sites is coming from social media, you darn well better take that seriously. And then the third piece, I think, starts getting me thinking at least about, okay, what could we do? So somebody over here raised the idea of creating a new portal where we aggregate all this information. And I actually am a skeptic about the idea of a new portal. And we have 301 sites already. Why is site number 302 going to get an appreciable share of the traffic? On the other hand, if we did a better job of cross-linking among the 301 sites, each of which has its own loyal audience to some degree, but don't assume that the only thing they want is the stuff that I publish, then I think things start to get interesting. And so I certainly think it would be worth looking at ways to build an ecosystem headlines widget that is shared among multiple sites and everybody feeds it with their content. From a research standpoint, I have a vested interest in saying, look, we actually have probably 60% of a really great data set that would help scholars understand how people move around the ecosystem. And frankly, what we need at the moment is some scholars who might be interested in continuing to work with us on building this out and producing some real solid academic research out of this. So if there's anybody here or on the live stream who's interested in working with me on that, please get in touch, because I think it's an unusual opportunity to have both the crawl data for a particular time window and the links data for that time window, and to look at how those things relate to one another. I also think, and a number of you were here from other markets, I think one of the things I really respect, aside from the fact that the Trust actually gave us some money to do this research and time, an excuse to do it, which was great and a great opportunity to learn, I really respect the way the Trust has made a commitment in terms of, look, they have a grant for, a program called Community News Matters, whose mission is to improve the local news ecosystem in however it can be improved. But they haven't just done it by throwing money at stories or sites. They've done it by actually trying to understand the ecosystem. And so I think we've done enough work now in Chicago on both the links part and the traffic part to say, you know what, there's something here. This can be useful in other markets, and it would be very interesting to see similar work done in other markets and compare. Cross comparisons are a staple of academic research. You learn a lot by looking at how different communities, different networks work. Finally, for the Trust, funders, others who are interested in how do we make this new ecosystem successful in terms of people being informed. I think anything from encouraging to incenting local publishers to collaborate on headline sharing across sites is worth looking at. Jan Schaefer is here with us from JLab. They've had a couple of initiatives that have actually worked to promote link sharing partnerships between the big traditional media and the micro publishers. And I think in a number of those markets that has been very successful for both parties. Okay, so a report coming out in a month of that. So the point is, we can understand why the little sites would like to get links from the big sites, right? I think what you will see in this research is, in fact, the big sites benefit from having, being part of this ecosystem as well. Finally, I think one of the things, we have the most measurable medium ever, but in fact, what that does is we're drowning in measurement. And we're actually lacking actionable measurement. And I think the project that we went through in terms of getting these 98 sites and looking at the links has made me think hard about, well, could we do this on a larger scale in a local market with the right protections for the publishers so that the information they don't want released isn't widely shared? I mean, essentially what we started to build in this database is the local Nielsen ratings for Chicago media online. And it's information that's now scattered across 301 different analytics systems. And we've put it together, at least started to put it together in a form that could be useful for publishers to benchmark themselves against other publishers. It could be useful for advertising sales if you protected confidential information in that way. And it could be very useful for researchers like the Community Media Workshop who are trying to really figure out where the reach is, which sites are getting traction. And I would love, I think we still would like to know, what's the relative balance of the value of creating original content versus aggregating content versus linking versus getting links, and developing this kind of a data set and doing it over time, which I think we've demonstrated is possible and can yield some interesting insights, I think is worth looking at as well in this or other markets. That concludes our presentation, and thank you very much. We will now happily take some questions. Yes, we have 15 minutes or so for questions. Howard.
Hi, how you doing?
Hang on, we're going to give you a mic, I think.
Rick, good to see you. I'm Howard Owens, for those who don't know me. This is something that's really fascinating to me.
I think your mic's either not on or...
How's that?
Say one more time.
How's that?
There we
okay.
go.
Okay, Rich.
I happen to know that Howard has a very good broadcast voice.
So Howard Owens. This is a fascinating topic and something 4 or 5 years ago I started to really kind of pay attention to for some other reasons. And when I was with Gatehouse Media, I had access to 100 different newspaper sites to kind of study linking and traffic. Did you, it doesn't sound like you did, but I want to kind of clarify, and this is both sort of a statement and something to respond to.
Yeah.
Look at the percentage of traffic that's sent by a link from a homepage. For example, we'll stick with Andrew's Gaper's block. I'm sure he has a very high volume homepage, and he's sending off a good number of, the receiving site loves to see those numbers. But I'm guessing, based on kind of what I've studied, the top ranked link any day isn't even getting 10% of his traffic. That the amount of you have to have a very high volume of traffic to send a high volume of traffic to another site.
So
Do you does that make
I
sense?
do understand the question, I think. And so a couple things. First of all, once we got the data and were able to slice it, the place where we really were able to look at the relationship was really only the smallest category of sites. Smallest in terms of the size of the linking site as opposed to the link receiving site. So we are starting with this research at a fairly low bar in terms of traffic. There's no question that a link from the homepage of the Chicago Tribune will drive many more users than a link from the homepage of Gaper's Blog or Center Square Journal or Catalyst. Now, that said, the Chicago Tribune rarely links to anything outside of the Chicago Tribune from the homepage or otherwise. What I think we saw with Andrew's site is, at least looking within this universe of small sites, what differentiates them is the prominence, the number, and the regularity of external linking. And I think what my hypothesis would be that Andrew has trained his audience to come there and value those links. So it's not just incidental, whereas there's other sites that are below the average number of, say, traffic per link. And the issue is their audiences are not trained to expect that because, in fact, that's not what people go there for. And I think, the hypothesis I'm throwing out is, we would all be better served in terms of people finding the stuff that's relevant to them if
Well,
we had more linking.
I think it's be an interesting area of study, and you can do it far more academically than I have been able to do. Use an example, say, of Drudge Report.
Yes.
Maybe 1,000 links on that page. I think if you did a graph of it, it'd look like a long tail. But the head of that tail would still be only 10% of his traffic, is my theory.
Yeah, well, I mean,
and I think that gets into some homepage design. I think people should consider how they're using links.
Yes.
And then the second part that I wanted to bring up, if you looked at link quality, because label heads have different responses, and then there's somebody who rewrites the head. Like, I don't know if Andrew does this, but rewriting a headline and adding your own blurb probably works a lot better than just grabbing whatever headline happened to appear.
I have no doubt of that, and that was beyond the scope of this study. I would say that if I had it to do over again, one thing we would do that we did not do in this case is actually capture the linking and linked to page information so that we could look at what are, is it better to have the link be a headline, an embedded text link, a related links box off to the side. We did not get into that in this study. I do think that is something that would be, it's interesting. I guarantee you sites like Huffington Post and AOL, they actually test these things and know the answer. And probably if you can't do this research yourself, first thing I would do is go look to someplace like Huffington Post and look how they do it, because they probably, they test it. But I also think from an academic and a research standpoint, it would be interesting the next time we do this, and I hope we'll get a chance to do it again, to do that. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you about that. Yes.
Hi, Rich. Michael Doyle, usual suspect. I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
So my comment is, when I go to my bank's website or the CTA's website or Metrorail, I don't view myself as a member of a news audience. I'm just looking for information. I go there, I leave, that's it.
Yes.
When I celebrate my use of JavaScript blocking and read the Chicago Tribune bypassing the paywall, I am a member of a news audience.
I understand.
So I asked you 2 years ago at this event, what's the relevance of including, for want of a better term, like dumb information sites like Metrorail or CTA in with, for want of a better term, smart news sites like the Tribune or like Gaper's Block. And you told me 2 years ago, give us some time, we need more research, and I'll have an answer for you. So not to put you on the spot, but it's 2 years later, so I'm asking that question again. So what is the relevance? I assume that there must be some relevance to knowing, is there a way for local news producers to knowing that sites like Metrorail have such incredible inbound traffic? What can we do with that? How can we make that work for us? And if we can't, then why is it in there?
Well, so, the simple answer for why it's in there is, in the nature of what we did, we were not trying to, anything that provided news and information about the Chicago market for Chicago readers is in our universe. The reality is, the reason that they show up high in our study is they actually do get linked to a lot. It's not just that people, I don't think actually most people go to the CTA website regularly just to check what's latest on the CTA. On the other hand, if Gaper's Block writes a story about the route changes, they might in fact link to that. And that is, it is, as Jeff Jarvis likes to say, do what you do best and link to the rest. If, in fact, the CTA has the best available description of their route changes, I think it's great that Gaper's Block links to it. And I think that's providing a useful piece of information for the user that makes it unnecessary for Andrew to write a story describing what that says. Now, in terms of I think what you saw from this research, what we actually don't have a lot of the traffic information from the governmental websites, which is interesting because conceptually all I have to do is FOIA them and they'll get it to me, but they didn't respond quickly to my requests for information. I'm going to just have to FOIA them, which is why I'd like to do a little more time on this research project. I think it's an open question in my mind, do people follow that link? to the CTA website to get that information. And if I had their referral logs, I could start to answer that question. I do not have them. I did, in fact, try to get the City of Chicago and the CTA and the City Library, the Chicago Public Library sites. One of the reasons why I feel like I'm not done is I'd like to see us really add that out so we can start to answer the question of what value do those municipal sites have in the ecosystem. My hypothesis is it's actually higher than you might think, but as you heard already, it's a different methodology than the community workshop did, where they really were exclusively looking at original content sites and leaving out those other sources. Now, there are people in the room who are associated with nonprofits and government agencies, and I think, you know, it's a really exciting thing if you're in that line of work to realize that now I don't need to rely on the media to get my story out. I can put it out myself and get the 301 sites in the ecosystem to refer people to it instead of using up the limited space that might be in the Tribune to cover that story. So I don't know if it's a satisfactory answer. I think, you know, we are, as you've seen from both these research projects, each time we do them, we try to learn from the last time around and do a better job the next time. And if we get a chance to do some more, we'll try to do that the next time as well.
I have one here, Rich.
Pardon? Okay, yeah.
Rich. Hi.
Hi.
Once again, Carl West.
Hi, Carl.
I have such a great passion for creating the content for my news service, but at the end of the day, for me, it's an absolute business. And I want to talk about the viability and the possibilities of these online premises being able to make money outside of course, the idea of creating this piece and then, of course, selling it off to a bigger company, but just to create and make a viable daily news organization that can remain profitable for someone.
Yes. Well, so that's well beyond the scope of my study. I will say, are you going to Block by Block, the Block by Block conference this tomorrow and Saturday? Okay, because I think, you know, from what I can tell, having been to the last two and looking forward to the third, that's the place where you're going to find, you know, the people who have the best answers for you. And one of the things I think, you know, without taking away their thunder, you know, at this stage, what we know is that the traditional model, which is advertising based on eyeballs, that's pretty much the way newspapers work, it's the way television worked, it's the way the first generation of web advertising worked, is not enough to make your thing a business. You're going to hear from sites at Block by Block that have developed whole other lines of business related to what they do, but not just selling advertising around it. That is how most of them are building, starting to build a sustainable revenue base to support the business they want to do. And you know, it's a great question. You know, I think, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's great that people who want to do it because they love it now can, and there are communities that are being well served by people who are doing it because they love it. But at the end of the day, whether they can make a business out of it, it's probably going to determine whether they sustain themselves over the long term. And I think that's, you know, I don't have the answer for that. I have some questions. I think we need to figure out how to make it worth people's while to link out. And I, you know, that may be a technology that hasn't been built yet, or it may be, you know, people collaborating in new ways. I don't know.
So,
One more question.
I don't want to cut you off, so hang on. Vivian's got the microphone. I guess we have one more. Why don't we take my friend here and here, I'll pass the mic to her.
All right, sorry.
Sorry, come talk to me afterward. Okay? Yeah, it's a great question.
Hi, my name's Michelle Ferrier. Still not on? Yes.
There.
Hi, I'm Michelle Ferrier, and I'm interested in the question of both these reports looking at geographically, were you able to map where there are areas, physical areas, geographic areas that are not covered by the ecosystem, or look at an audience analysis where you're seeing the people that are not being reached through the websites?
I think that's probably a question best answered by the community media workshop folks. We did not attempt to place these geographically on a map. I think we know that there are huge swaths of Chicago that are not well served. On the other hand, they weren't well served in the mass media era either. So, I mean, I think there is the potential for that situation to improve themselves. Pilsen Portal is a great example. Here's a situation where actually an economic development organization has said, you know what, one of the needs we have for economic development is to have people in this community better served with information, and they've put some of their resources for economic development into doing that. And there's a network of sites like that in Chicago, the LISC sites that do that. And I think it's a really interesting idea. And I think it also goes to your question over here, which is, you know, the traditional business model did not solve this problem in the old days, but there are now new ways that are potentially in place to do that. Do you guys want to add something to that? Yeah.
This year's research did not map, but we have no reason to believe that the situation has changed that much, other than our general conclusion that the most exciting stuff is happening on the neighborhood level, and the community portals that LISC has done, the kind of newer listservs, such as Carl's valuable new service, are beginning to fill in gaps that we previously saw, particularly in the west and south side of the city.
I'm going to add one other thing, which is there's been some really interesting research out from Pew recently that documents how deep into communities of very modest means the smartphone is delving now. You know, I think that when to access digital information, you needed to have a $2,000 computer and a $20 a month or $30 a month internet connection, to now be something that everybody, a lot of people are getting, even people of very modest means, because it is both a phone, an interpersonal communication device, and a platform to get news and information. I think that's a really exciting thing for communities of relatively modest means and minority communities in places like Chicago. So, you know, I think I would say we're still going to have the issue of how do you find the information. It's even harder to navigate the small screen than it is the large screen. But you know, I think there's some pretty exciting possibilities there.
The only other thing I'd add is we know from past research that in Chicago specifically, low-income neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, a lot of neighborhoods on the south and west side are underrepresented. And the Trust and the workshop actually worked together last year to put together the local reporting initiative to give small grants to reporters and people telling stories about those communities. And I think that's still a gap we see. We see it in the fact that ethnic media is having a hard time moving online. We see it in those neighborhood news rankings. And you know, I don't know what the solution is, but I think it still exists, and there are some efforts out there to try to fill that gap.
Thanks to Zach and Rich and Nora and Tom and Emily.